Hello Aces 102. I'm going to be covering fundamentals of crop production by video. I want to acknowledge the original creator of these slides, Cameron Pittelcow. He's an assistant professor in our crop sciences department here. He focuses on agronomy in particular. He couldn't join us this year, and I couldn't find a suitable replacement, so you'll have to accept me. Cameron was kind enough to share his slides so that I could make this presentation for you. I've broken it down into 4 parts so that you can get a good feel for it is and break up your viewing pleasure as you go along. I'll continue to release these over the next few days so that you can catch up. So let's get started. So in particular, Cameron likes to present an overview of agriculture, and it's really an applied use of photosynthesis. We impact the carbon cycle quite heavily. Photosynthesis is inherently a process that harvests carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's important that you know and understand that. We control or manage the way in which we enhance this process by controlling our environments. Now, controlling our environments most often occurs in outdoor fields where we prepare an environment in the field to handle the growth of crops. But we can do it in very highly controlled environments, very engineered environments, bringing livestock and animal production indeed indoors. We'll be mostly focusing on crop production for these videos, but indeed that is the case here, and that's what's being depicted by this image. It's important for you to recognize and to really not forget, actually, growing crops extracts mineral resources from the earth, sometimes fairly aggressively, depending on the crop we're dealing with. This is why, indeed, we need to have fertilization in order to replace whatever is extracted by those crops. It's really, as Cameron puts it, simple math. If the crop is taking up a mineral resource, it's no longer in the soil. It's a mass balance issue too. And if you continue to do that, eventually you will deplete that location of its mineral resources, and your crop, that process which you're seeking to control, is going to suffer because of it. So a table like this, it can be particularly useful in a region like ours. It's important to notice corn is a major crop here, and it tends to be particularly extractive of nitrogen on a per unit area basis, on a per mass basis, since so much of it is grown. So high yielding crops extract more. Not all at the same rate, depending on the underlying biological mechanisms. You can extract different amounts of resources. Now, agriculture is in the forefront of our science and our news these days. Population, you guys know this very well, going up, demand going up. We often talk about doubling our food production in order to make up for the difference when we're considering those higher populations. Now that being said, we can be optimistic here. The trend suggests that many of our major crops indeed are increasing in their productivity since the Green Revolution. Unfortunately, so if you project out along those solid lines, we're probably not quite doubling. That's what the dashed lines are intended to show. That if we wanted to truly double, we probably really need to get along those dashed lines, whereas the solid lines are what we're currently projecting at current existing growth rates over the past 50 to 60 years. There are environmental concerns. There's no free lunch, right? So we are using energy resources to support our crop production systems. We are using water at high rates. We are impacting water quality by allowing nutrient from the land to move into the water due to our practices. That man there is being depicted in a wheat field, spreading fertilizer in a wheat field. Um, Greenhouse gases, whenever you're consuming energy or indeed capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, you are creating a gas exchange that can be observed and can be measured. So oftentimes when we're thinking about responding to our growing populations, growing demands, we do look at agriculture and begin to consider where our available opportunities are. So agriculture consumes currently about almost 40% of the land in our world. But there are other undeveloped lands on the left side that are potentially available to us, and a number of different other types of land that we are currently utilizing as a species on this planet. So it's important to note that we're not using all the land. Maybe that's an opportunity. Not all that land is necessarily ideal. Forest, high mountains, and tundra are probably not the best places to be growing our future crops. So we're probably most likely focusing on those human-modified lands on the right-hand side, both columns on the right-hand side, in order to make them more productive, use them more efficiently and effectively. It's important to note, though, and you know this, our crops consume quite a lot of water. 70% of our global freshwater consumption is attributed to our plants specifically, not yet considering the downstream consumption of processing our agricultural products into, well, livestock or other agricultural products. So notice the deep red areas, including where we are right now, are those areas that have a high water footprint. They consume the most water in all these different areas. Some of those areas are irrigated, and some of them are not. So, and that depends on what crops are being grown in those regions, whether or not rain is sufficient to provide the irrigation necessary for those crops. And in areas where highly consuming crops are grown, where there's insufficient rain, of course, irrigation has to come in to make up the difference. You might, at that point, be considering water to be the number one nutrient, one that we certainly can't ignore. So let's not romanticize things. Water's high. Crop production is highly consuming. Food systems contribute to a significant portion of global greenhouse gases. There are impacts. There are impacts and there are challenges. So, what is the current state of our system, and what can we learn from the current state of our system as we project forward in order to grow more and implement that system more? So that image on the left, when we talk about conventional agriculture, like it or hate it, is probably a staged image. Maybe in Brazil, I think we do see some massive lands that are allocated that would require massive capital in the form of tractors in this case to handle the harvest. You can imagine that's a huge operation, many millions of dollars going into that particular image in the form of capital. And that's not limited to operations on the ground, right? That's a crop dusting operation. Maybe it's a fertilizer, maybe it's an herbicide or a pesticide that's being sprayed. That being said, like it or hate it, we are always trying to improve things. Agriculture is a form of biology. It's an applied biology, you may say. The functionality of our ecosystems are going to be a function of the interactions between the environments that our crops are grown in. So, what's in that environment? Well, there's the soil, the plants that we select ourselves in the form of crops, as well as other plants that come in and become weeds, other plagues that come in the form of insects or even disease, not listed here. The climate, the environment, the local weather that is impacting the crop. You can imagine a number of others. We control some of these, and we are subject to some of these. So we seek to manage then. You have to imagine we do understand quite a lot about the biology, not everything, but we also then seek to manage what we know in order to improve yields. And that could happen here locally. Um, this fellow here is in South Dakota, not too far away from here. And on the right, we seek to also manage systems which are probably a lot more primitive than the ones that we're thinking about. There is a process to this, particularly on the conventional side. Most of this presentation, in the first two segments of this presentation, we're going to be talking about this process here. We're not going to get through all of this in the first video. But you can see once we get to the end of the process, it does repeat upon itself from a season to season basis. In some places, the season is yearly, one crop a year. In some places, it might be many. Oops, wrong direction. So let's start from the top then, getting to land preparation and soil management. Which of these two fields do you think you would want to plant? And the answer is the one on the left. And there's a clear, I hope you can appreciate or begin to appreciate a clear reason. The first time I think Cameron showed me these two photographs, I didn't necessarily see the difference between them. You know, I'm not per se a farmer. I've studied farming a lot, but I don't do it myself. But even what some of us might consider to be relatively minor slopes like this can have a pretty major impact. And here's why. I love Calvin and Hobbes. This is a pretty good comic strip. I'll give you a second to read it. But the key is that the distances associated as you move around the curvature of various slopes on the land do cause the shape of the field to be more complicated. We as humans, we tend to work and operate better in straight lines. And that field on the left there, I'll move back now, hopefully you've read the whole thing, is amenable to straight lines. That field on the right may be amenable to some straight lines, but eventually a manager will have to start dealing with the curvature of the field and disrupt his approach to straight lines. And you can see, at least in this particular image on the right-hand side, several different strategies in order to handle the complexity of that field have been applied, at least by this particular manager. And there might be great reasons, probably a great farmer, but it's not always as easy as one might think. Given some understanding of the land that you're dealing with, it does become useful to start preparing that land to receive receive the seeds that are going to be planted in those soils. We've been doing this since the invention of agriculture. We talked about this. That first plow was probably just a stick in the land that was utilized to dig many holes as opposed to one hole at a time. Animal power comes into play, is still used in some parts of the world today, but mechanized power can be a huge benefit, and for a number of different reasons. Mainly, the most important being allowing fewer people to manage larger and larger tracts of land in the same amount of time. What do we do when we're tilling the land? We're leveling the land. We're preparing that land for receiving the type of seed that's going to go into it. And that's, the type of soil will become a major impact. There's residue left over from the previous crop, so it's worthwhile for me to go back to this image here. That field on the right hasn't been handled yet, and the residue is there. You can't see the dirt, the soil beneath it yet, right? You're in that process handling weeds as well, trying to avoid those weeds from outcompeting the seed that you're seeking to plant in place. When you're dealing with outdoor environments, there's always seeds, always on a regular basis coming and being applied again, either by themselves through the wind, maybe through birds, or maybe through a number of other different processes. And in some cases, we actually put the seed bed, we take it to a point where we shape it into beds in order to help the management of whatever type of crop. you might have. So I have a few examples we can show you here. Different types of tillage, some more aggressive than the others. One where you want to remove all the residue, top left. One where you can deal with individual strips within the field. Leaving some residue behind can be a benefit even. So you want to keep the residue where you want the residue. We would probably plant in those strips. Or in the bottom case, actually building up the bed. The planting will probably, in that instance, occur on the top of that bed, allowing those furrows to go through, allowing things to move away or collect in those furrows that you want to keep away from the top of the bed. Fertility matters. So as you move through your field, the quality of your soil will still dictate most of what goes up into the plant. But as we mentioned before, you are mining that resource away from the soil as you move from season to season. When we're seeking to plant crops, generally speaking, the goal has always been to maximize yields, maximize the growth of the crop. Excuse my phone. Maximize the yield of those crops in order to maximize the profitability and the productivity of the system for the growers and the profit of the system. How do we do that? We seek to provide non-limiting conditions. Non-limiting conditions. We'll talk about that more in a little while in the next video. But this is done by, generally speaking, seeking soils themselves that are very healthy and providing the fertilizer in order to avoid those shortfalls in any one nutrient. This usually requires a lot of nutrient and usually from a combination of soil and fertilizer in the end. Okay? What are the essential nutrients? I often refer people straight to the periodic table of elements. For this, here's a slightly more focused listing. But ultimately, you can make an argument that almost every nutrient is necessary at some level for most growing organisms, especially the more complex ones like us. But indeed, these are all necessary nutrients, and you can conclude here, or seek to make a conclusion here by coming to realize that almost all cells and all plants, and really all animals, need all the essential nutrients at some amount, at some level. In this case, do take a moment to look through that table later. You know, we can even identify in many cases, based on our understanding of biology, what those elements are utilized for within different parts of the plant. Indeed, some of them are used in a few different places throughout the plant. And eventually we have to apply that fertilizer. There are a number of different ways. You can get very precise, doing it by hand, plant by plant. These are both corn crops. And in the absence of mechanization, you might choose to do this. This also manages the amount that you put down. If you begin to understand and know and appreciate each individual plant in your field, you might be able to know where this one even needs a little bit more fertilizer than the other. Doing things at scale, however, when you're working with hundreds or even thousands of acres, this is where mechanization really has it. It becomes a little bit more difficult to know and understand the individual plant within the larger system. And in instances like this, you might go for a mechanized approach, broadcasting the nutrient down. What are some of the key differences here? Well, you know, as long as she can walk through the field and sneak in and among her plants, she can get in there to apply a little bit of extra care. In this case, in the form of fertilizer, but you can imagine it could be expanded to other inputs. In his case, his big hunk of steel is only allowed in the field until it really can't drive over it anymore, until he himself in that machine becomes a risk to the crop beneath. That becomes the consideration, and that means our management will end up becoming limited by access. And eventually you do have a challenge to get through the field in order to take care of these things. So I believe this is the end of our presentation for now. I'll be uploading this to your website real soon, and you'll see some more videos coming in the next couple days. I hope all is well, don't hesitate to let us know if you have any questions. We'll try to do our best to clarify whether or not it's me or if we're contacting Cameron or some other experts in the field to help resolve your questions.